Hello from New York, I'm Chris Hayes. With me this morning, I have Harvard University professor Steven Pinker, who wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, Washington Post blogger Jamila Bey, Susan Jacoby, the author of Free Thinkers, Robert Wright from The Atlantic, and author of The Evolution of God, and joining us from Washington, Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion. We were just engaged in, I think, a really interesting debate about the degree, where we sort of draw lines between public and private belief, what we subject to scrutiny, how we go after other people's, whether they be public beliefs or private beliefs, specifically in the case of people's religious beliefs, and whether the privately held doctrinal beliefs that one might have should be subject to public scrutiny or even ridicule, I think, as Richard Dawkins suggested. And Stephen, I was telling you during the break that you're very polite, and you said you're Canadian, so that explains it. But you didn't get a chance to weigh in there, and I want to give you one.
Well, it's interesting how the debate has changed. And it used to be that people debated whether evolution should be allowed to be taught. Now it's whether the case for so-called scientific creationism should be added to the mix. Even there, what is supposed to be taught is not biblical doctrine, but the ginned-up so-called scientific evidence for creation. Likewise, the debate used to be on whether homosexuality should be criminalized. That debate isn't held anymore. Now it's about gay marriage. Whether contraception should be legal. That debate is over. It's been won. Now it's just on whether Catholic organizations have to include in their health insurance.
For no copay.
Yeah, right. For issue after issue, the entire debate has shifted in a more progressive, humanistic direction. We tend to lose sight of that because at any given moment we're talking about the issue of the day, of the morning, of the minute. But over short and long-term stretches of history, one can see the progress that we've been made in an era in which, as you showed at the top of the show, secularism has been increasing, religious fundamentalist beliefs have been decreasing.
One of the things I think is so interesting about this debate is the ways in which, in the context particularly of global warming, which is, I think, the single most important issue we face and where the stakes of all of this are the highest, the very slippery way in which the liberal spirit of tolerance and open-mindedness is used to defend skepticism on the scientific consensus on global warming, right? So when you listen to people talk about, when you listen to people who are attacking the very robust scientific consensus on the warming planet, they will say basically, well, we're just asking questions, right? We're engaging in the good skepticism that you say that you hold to, and then of course there's a religious component to a lot of this disbelief as well. Here, Rick Santorum is talking about climate scientists in the Philadelphia Inquirer op-ed in February, and he says climate change's Pharisees reassure us that global warming science is still settled. There's nothing to see here. Move along. Bob, how do you deal with that argument about skepticism, which kind of uses a sort of open-mindedness of the liberal tradition in a sort of jujitsu move against itself?
Well, it's actually a challenge because skepticism is a good thing, and you should always, up to a point, question even what seems to be scientific consensus. In the case of evolution, I think we've gone well past the point where you can reasonably question the fundamental premise. Climate science is tricky because the truth is most of us haven't had time to really delve into details. I don't feel I can launch...
But that's true about everything.
Well, no, evolution, I really feel I know enough. I can argue because I've invested the time.
Right.
I don't think those issues are comparable in the sense of being fundamentally religious. I mean, first of all, I know a number of atheists who are actually climate science skeptics, A. And B, there's no inherent contradiction between Scripture and global warming the way there is between a literal reading of Genesis and evolution.
As it is unfolding in America, though, and I think here is where I'm shape-shifting to Jamila's etch-a-sketching and Richard Dawkins.
Shook up during the break.
Climate change is being used as a religious issue because the paragraph they're all using is the verse from Genesis that gives man dominion over the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Now, liberal religious people use that to say, yes, and we have to do it wisely.
We have a custodial responsibility.
Conservative religious people say, we can do whatever we want with the earth. As Santorum himself has said, not for the sake of earth, but for the sake of us. So if what we think is good for us is to strip the earth of all of its natural resources, well, that's our right, because we're such big, good, smart human beings.
Stephen.
Yeah, I think we always face the agonizing dilemma of what range of opinion
exactly. Yes,
you don't want to have a show where you say, well, on the one side, denying the Holocaust, we have so-and-so.
Yes.
On the other hand, you do want to be able to marshal quickly and clearly what the evidence is. If there is a Holocaust denier, you really should be able to come up with 6 indisputable facts that show the Holocaust really did take place. And likewise, climate scientists do have the onus of having a comprehensible set of arguments why they believe that climate is changing. Likewise for evolution, a defender of evolution should have the evidence at his or her fingertips to persuade people to the extent that they can be persuaded.
You have put your finger on literally the driving thing that we think about every week when we put together the show, right? Which is, what is the range of opinion, right? Where do you put the stake in the spectrum? And that's this. And where you put the stake in the middle, or where you put it, determines a lot of what kind of conversation you have and how the conversation moves forward.
Because ultimately, you don't want it to just boil down to trust, that they're the priests on one side, they're the scientific priests on the other side. The difference is that the reason that I do trust in scientists, even when I don't know every detail, is that every time I've had to check, they have had facts and arguments. They've earned that trust. They have to keep re-earning it by being able to put the arguments on the table.
I'm a little bit of a defeatist about this, because I really do think in the day-to-day world of lived experience of people as citizens, as voters, so much does come down to trust. It is about whose sources. When you say I haven't really dug into the climate science, and when you say I can defend evolution, it's like, well, yeah, I can defend evolution in the way that someone who's like read the Richard Dawkins book can defend evolution. But like, how can I defend evolution? I more or less paraphrase from The Selfish Gene, which Mr. Dawkins wrote. Like, that's and I more or less trust it because other people seem to trust it, and Richard Dawkins has all these credentials, and so
no, but it has to go beyond that. That if you were to challenge Richard on any of the facts, if you were to follow up on the footnotes of The Selfish Gene, you would find there really are peer-reviewed scientific papers with evidence that you can't deny.
Richard, you face this. I think you face this all the time, right? I mean, these arguments about skepticism and the way that attempts to undermine evolution as a sort of bedrock foundational fact about the way the world developed are often couched in this kind of liberal language of tolerance. What's your sort of response to that?
Yes, I agree with what all the panel have said about that. For me, there is a distinction between climate change, which I don't really feel qualified to speak about, and evolution, where I really do. And I agree with Robert Wright about that. I agree with what Susan said. I agree with what Stephen said. But I also strongly agree with what Stephen said, that even those bits of science that we actually haven't read up ourselves, we trust because science has earned the trust. We know about peer review. We know that if a position has been argued in the scientific literature, it will be challenged, it will be tested. And so there is a sort of robustness about scientific conclusions which science has earned, and theology, which is a total non-subject, hasn't. In the case of climate change, by the way, it's not just Genesis, it's also Revelation. We don't need to bother to have good stewardship of the world because Jesus is coming back, and soon. I mean, that's one of the dominant arguments that you'll hear from these nutcases.
But just to underscore the challenge, I think Stephen and I both remember a time, we've written about evolutionary psychology, when there was what seemed to be a consensus, at least within psychology, that bringing in considerations of natural selection into the study of human nature was almost illegitimate. And I think we both agree. There was something like a consensus that we agree was basically wrong. So you do have to be skeptical even of consensus. Yeah. And in climate science, the reason I feel confident is because of opportunities I've had to interrogate people in the field, not always even scientists, but people who just know this stuff. And the public at large, I don't
doesn't have that opportunity.
I mean, they see two conflict. They don't know. You can always trot out one scientist from some college.
Right. But this is the problem. This is the bedrock problem of not just this issue. I mean, it's the bedrock problem that we face in sort of the project of self-governance and like keeping the civilizational project going, which is that, someone works 12 hours a day. They get home. They have to deal with childcare. They have to, I live this life where I go talk to a climate scientist and then I can interrogate them.
Right.
The way that it cascades down is it cascades down through these trust relationships, right? And so those trust trust relationships are forged. They're not forged on the basis of going back and forth with someone. They're forged on the basic of affiliation, of identity relationship, of kinship, of consonance of worldview, of the degree to which you feel this person is trustworthy. So when someone who fits all those things says, do not listen to the climate scientists, they are trying to pull the wool over your eyes, the question of how you attack that authority from outside the sphere of it is the most important one. And I want you to answer that, Susan Jacoby, after this break.
That's something.
We have spiraled upwards, as we always do on the show, into abstraction, but I want to ground it because I really do. This is something that I have a whole chapter in my book about, and something I think about a lot. It's like the process of public belief formation, because ultimately that's how we get our policies, right? I mean, and that process is a complicated one, and how we move public opinion in a certain direction, social consensus, when it's not even just moral precepts, right? It's not normative questions, but it's just actually empirical questions that describe what is happening to the world. Is it getting warmer? Is it getting warmer because of the carbon that humans are releasing into the world? I want to show this graph. It shows correlation between religious affiliation and the percentage of people believing in man-made global warming. I should say human-made global warming. So total U.S. population, about 45% believe that trust the scientific consensus, or believe in the scientific consensus on global warming. People who are unaffiliated religiously are much more likely to believe in the scientific consensus, up near 60%, and white evangelicals are far less likely to believe in it. And I think we've seen the way in which the issue has been sort of transmuted into a culture war issue, fundamentally, where we're now in the place of trust and authority and tribal signaling, as opposed to a discussion of evidence, right?
But let's say also this is an educational issue, and nobody wants to say this because you get accused of saying that religious fundamentalists are stupid. And by the way, I want to point out that not all evangelicals are fundamentalists. There are educated liberal evangelicals as well. But there is a direct correlation between
They're educated fundamentalists, I should say, actually.
But there is a direct correlation between the prevalence of religious fundamentalists and lack of education. And this is probably what Santorum was talking about, too. You go to college, you get to be liberal. No. But you go to college, you presumably learn something about real science, real history. And so there is, the fact is people with 8th grade and partial college education, about 80% of them describe themselves as conservative religious.
But I'll bet the graph we just saw is not entirely a product of an education gap, per se. My guess is that the evangelicals, because of social issues and so on, came to trust certain validators, the conservative validators.
That's right.
And now this issue arises, and those validators are saying, no, global warming isn't happening. And I've got to think that's a big part of it.
But the validators, you trust are a question of education, too.
I think there's a, excuse me, a perfect marriage between what the two of you are saying. It is absolutely an issue of education. Americans at large don't understand how to question appropriate. They hear something, they go, well, I trust the source that I'm listening to, and they don't know how to say, well, who funded that study?
Right.
Where did the money come from? Were there any universities? What exactly does it mean to have a study that's peer reviewed? And what does it mean that this is someone who I've heard on a show with a host whose name I might or might not like? The fact that John Huntsman, when he was in the race, said, call me crazy, but I believe in evolution. I believe the scientists on global warming, and people did.
We featured that tweet a lot. But I want to push back on that just for 1 second, because again, I disagree with what you're saying there. I don't think I consider myself a pretty educated person. In fact, this is my professional full-time job, is doing this. I'm very lucky that this is all I do, is think about this stuff, and I read peer-reviewed studies and things like that. And if I am honest with myself, I am still at a fundamental level relying on trust to a certain degree. And there's no way of getting around that and to pretend that, oh, what we, the enlightened cognoscenti, do is so different from what they are doing who just trust authority, I think is really self-delusional. I think I really do. Stephen.
Yes, but you are skeptical about your trust in that you ask the question, who should I trust and why? And you have a reason for trusting some people rather than others, that you know that every time they are challenged, they can come up with the evidence and the arguments. And by the way, I think the politicization of these issues works both ways. I know a number of climate scientists who say that the worst thing that has ever happened in raising awareness of climate change is Al Gore's movie, because he, in effect, politicized it. Not that anything that he said in the documentary they had a problem with.
Just because he is a figure that is associated, obviously, with a certain political party and ideology, and so now it's actually a reverse effect, right? Rather than saying who you trust, it's who you don't trust, right?
Exactly.
And I feel that way on issues all the time. I mean, I remember seeing Alan Greenspan testify on behalf, in front of a Senate committee, and testify on behalf of immigration reform, liberalization of immigration reform, and being like, oh, maybe I'm wrong about immigration reform. Alan Greenspan is saying it.
So Al Gore can rev up the base, but at the same time, he is probably alienating the skeptics.
Richard Dawkins, how do you cross the sort of gulf of this sort of trust gap? I mean, that is the fundamental question, right? I mean, I think that's something that you're engaged in trying to do. How do you do it?
Well, I do agree it is a very, very difficult problem because nobody can read up all the scientific literature. Nobody, the best scientist in the world, can't keep up with science outside his or her own field. And so there really is a matter of trust. I keep agreeing with Steve when he says that science has earned the right to trust, because you know that when people are challenged in science, they can produce the evidence. They can say, look, here's Brown and McAllister 2008 showing so-and-so. You can actually cite chapter and verse. That's what I worry about in the earlier question about teach the controversy. If you say teach the controversy in science classes, it implies that there really is a controversy, that there really is a kind of balance of scientific weight on both sides. And there aren't two sides in that particular case of evolution. Maybe in climate change there are, and I don't feel knowledgeable enough to be sure about that. But in evolution,
well, I do, and I don't think there are.
Okay.
I mean, but again, like I think that because of all the times that I've spent talking to climate scientists, you know, who Bob.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds good to me. I mean, I get that.
Right. Just to get back to an earlier hobby horse of mine, and whether atheists should be confrontational, I do think if you want to inspire trust among evangelicals, and you're a climate scientist,
right,
I would avoid making fun of their religion. It's just elementary human psychology.
That seems like a pretty strong piece of advice.
This is my point,
Mr. Wright.
and I think it translates into the field I was talking about earlier, which is, you know, education policy.
Right. Or anything, really. Richard Dawkins is the executive director of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science and author of the book, The God Delusion, among others. Mr. Dawkins, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed.